The veteran's name is Dr. Dalton James. He was born on June 30th, 1928. He served in the Navy during both the Cold War and the Vietnam War. He achieved the rank of captain. We are recording this on November 22nd, 2013. My name is Zach Bruns, and I'm conducting the interview. No relation. Alright, so Dr. James, we'll start off just, how did you think about joining the service in the first place?
Okay, well, I always knew I wanted to go into medicine, and I was deferred during college, medical school, and internship. And I wanted to take a residency in obstetrics, but I said, well, I better get in the service before they yank me out. So I wanted to go in the Navy, so I didn't want to just do histories and physicals, recruiting station. So I volunteered for what I thought would be 2 years in submarines and diving and 6 years in the reserve. And they sent me, they sent me to the local naval hospital for a couple months while I was waiting to go to diving school. And I reported, and my uniform hadn't gotten there yet. So 10 minutes after I reported, I was delivering babies. So that was my indoctrination. While I was there, I got a set of orders to Surgical Mobile Team 15, and I called back the Bureau and I said, I thought I was going to diving school. They said, yeah, that was a mistake. 2 weeks later, I got a set of orders to Destroyer Squadron 5 in the Pacific, and I called them again. They said, that's another mistake. So anyway, in October, I went to diving school in Washington, D.C., and it was on the Anacostia River. We were trained in 15 feet of mud and 10 feet of water on the Anacostia River. They trained us to do what the divers do, and we did helium and oxygen and diving. We also learned how to calculate diving tables, so treating bends. It was a very interesting time. There were a lot of second-class divers, and there were 5 doctors that were there. Okay. From there, I went to submarine school. I was in the 100-officer submarine school in New London, Connecticut. What they did with the medical officers, they put us in for the first 6 weeks of the regular submarine school. And then after that, they sent us out on a submarine for 6 weeks down to the Caribbean. That was very interesting. I remember one of the places we went was Martinique, where we were the first submarine to be there since a German submarine had been there in World War II. We also stopped in Havana, and Castro was not in power yet, but that was an interesting visit. After I finished submarine school, I was sent to Submarine 6, which is in Norfolk, Virginia. I was there for 6 months when I married my wife, who was in medical school at the time. Okay. And I was there on a tender for 2 years where I lived. What I did mostly was take care of the medical needs of the 16 submarines. And it was an interesting group. Some of them were doing secret stuff up in the Arctic. Some of them were doing Regulus 1 missile firing. We had the U.S. Sea Line there, still the deck gun on board. And I used to ride it quite a bit. We'd take out some of the special forces. We'd surface off the shore and then paddle ashore in rubber boats and come back, and I'd go with them. Sometimes I get bored sitting on board. I did a lot of testing for people who wanted to go into diving school. We would put them in a pressure chamber, run them down to 60 feet, put them on oxygen, and bring them back. If they didn't have an end-toward episodes, then they were qualified. Well, a week before I was due to get married, we were doing this and had an air embolism, so I spent that week in the recompression chamber. Didn't manage to get out in time to get married, though. It was, an exciting time. I'd spend a week each month out at sea with the divers, and usually I would make one of the last dives in the day on helium oxygen, because I didn't want to just sit around doing nothing. And I'd wait till the last dive, so in case I had to treat anyone, I'd be available to treat them. We also treated a lot of civilians who were working at the tunnel bridge from Kiptopeke to Little Creek. And one time we treated the same fellow a couple times, and he suggested to the people he was working with that maybe he shouldn't be diving. I don't know if it was because he was not obeying the rules or they were cutting corners. Anyway, he was a little angry at me. He was going to take care of me, but some of the master divers on our sub on the squadron just persuaded him not to. But and then I rode a lot of the submarines that went out, and a lot of different. I tried to get aboard every submarine at least a few times. Then by the time I was finishing my tour of duty there, I was thinking about getting out and taking my OB residency. And my boss in the bureau said, why don't you take a Navy residency? You'll be in Oakland, and they'll pay a lot more than what you were doing. So I checked with my wife, and we agreed. So I spent the next 3 years in Oakland, California, getting my OB training. I thought I'd be sent to a hospital, but instead I get orders to see Admiral Rickover. So I went back to Washington. He was head of the nuclear program, and he interviewed me, and a couple other people interviewed me. And next thing I knew, I was on my way to Nuclear Power School in New London, and then spent 6 months at a nuclear prototype in Windsor Locks. And then from there I went to be the medical officer on the Thomas Edison. And I reported to it before it was even launched. They hadn't even buttoned it up yet. So I had to write the medical directives, and I had to examine everybody on board, and I had to find storage space for all my equipment. So oftentimes I was fighting myself for storage space for medical supplies with one of my duties as the librarian, looking for a place to put 1,000 paperbacks. But one time I found a beautiful locker, which I was able to get. Next time I went aboard, they had it almost totally obliterated by some piece of equipment under it. But I was thin enough I could crawl into it still. Anyway, it was interesting. Our sea trials, a lot of things happen to you that you don't want to talk to later on. But we went through all the sea trials, and then we got launched. Well, we got launched before we went on sea trials. Then we went on our shakedown cruise. We went down, and on the way, we were trying some new piece of equipment and not trying to stay undetected when a U.S. Destroyer came up, and just as we were surfacing, they ran us over. They thought we were a Russian submarine. Fortunately, they didn't hit us amidship. They hit us in the rudder. So we went into Norfolk, and there President Kennedy came aboard, made a visit with friends. Then we fired water slugs from our missile tubes, and they miscalculated the direction of the wind, so we soaked a lot of very high dignitaries on the pier. From there, we went to the shipyard where we got our rudder fixed. And while we were there, they got a little fire in the rudder. And the word went out over the radio, fire on nuclear submarine in the shipyard, which was not good publicity. And the fire department didn't seem to know what to do. So some of our sailors took a rowboat, went out there with a fire extinguisher and put it out. Then we got underway, and we couldn't steer very well. I was one of 3 qualified scuba divers on board. So we went back, and there was a crowbar stuck in the rudder, which said Newport News on it. So later when we got home, we sent it back to them. Anyway, then we thought we were going to have about 6 weeks of R&R, and suddenly the Cuban crisis came up. So suddenly they threw us aboard, sent us down to Savannah. We flew up with our missiles and went off on patrol. So for the next 63 days, we were out on patrol somewhere in the Arctic. And once a week, we'd have a drill. And you never knew until the end of the drill whether it was a real thing or not. But when you didn't know the outer doors were opening, then you say, okay, then I'll have something to go home to. So then after 63 days, we came back into Holy Lock, and the gold crew came there, and we had a brief turnover, and then I came back home. And I was there for the 3 months between patrols. And then I did go over one more time with my relief, and then I came back over. And my next tour duty was on a Submarine Squadron 10 there in New London. And I enjoyed that. We had some nuclear boats on that. So, while I was there, the Thresher went down during sea trials. Because on sea trials, you do things you never do again, like going to test depth and so forth. And it had a massive failure in one of their saltwater lines, and it had sunk during sea trials. So they were looking for a diving doctor. And the big expert in the area, Dr. Bond, asked if we'd be able to dive on the Trieste to it. And they said, no, there's not any way you'd get to dive. So he said, okay, Dalton can go. So I got to go. And since I was the only one there that had been to nuclear power school, on the 9th and 10th dive, I got to go down and identify stuff from the reactor compartment. And I'm happy to be on those 2 dives, because the rest of the time I was in a little boat rocking on the ocean while the Trieste was going down and coming up, trying to avoid being seasick. So after I finished that, then they were going to start a submarine medical center, similar to what the aviation medical center is. So a bunch of us went down to Pensacola, and we went through their program there, and then we came back, and I was the director of the first school of submarine medicine there. But some of the time I had additional duty for the research lab, and then some of the time when the medical officer in charge of the hospital wasn't there, I took his place. But it was interesting, because for a while, in the mornings I would be doing my duties as director of the submarine medical school. In the afternoon I'd be the medical officer at the in the escape training tank, and in the evenings I'd be delivering babies. And then in between times I'd be going out on sea trials on the various new submarines. So I couldn't imagine a more ideal way to spend your life. Yeah. From there, then I knew that I needed to get some more. I had deliveries, but I needed more surgery to get my boards in OB/GYN. I knew they had a new hospital at 29 Palms Marine Corps Base in the middle of the Mojave Desert. So I asked my detailer, could I go there? And he said, sure. My orders came out. They said, 4th Troop Surgeon, Fleet Marines, Marine Pacific. So I called. I said, does this mean I'm going to Vietnam? He said, no, you'll spend most of your time at the hospital there in 29 Palms. And he was right. I did spend most of my time there. Was able to deliver a lot of babies. I got to know a lot of very, very qualified Marines, too. We deployed about 55,000 troops from there during the Vietnam War in 2 years while I was there. We'd send them over, they get injured, come back, and then they go back over again. But then from there, I knew I was then going to end up as a force medical officer in the submarine force in the Pacific. But that would be 2 years away, so they sent me down to San Diego to be again medical officer in one of the submarine squadrons down there. So I was down there for their 2 years. Then I went to Pearl Harbor for 4 years as a medical officer. I was going to go, after 3 years, I was going to go to one of the senior colleges, the War College. And I had gone off with my wife on some R&R to Japan, and I get a message in the middle of that saying, they're not sending any doctors this year. So I was sent back, and I said, well, that's the way it is. So I came back. I spent another year there, and I decided to retire in 20. So for my last tour of duty, they said, where do you want to go? And I said, Mare Island, which is in the San Francisco area. And so I went there as a senior medical officer at Mare Island. And that was an interesting tour, because we had about 12 different commands that really responded to us. We had the riverboat people, we had the mothball fleet, we had some of the schools there, we had the Marines, and we had a lot of other people. And I had 12 very well-trained doctors that were there. And then after that, I was retiring, and I made arrangements to work at one of the state hospitals. But as I reported in a few days earlier, I discovered it was all administrative, and I didn't want that. So for 2 days, I was unemployed, from August 1st to August 2nd, 1974. Then I went over to Planned Parenthood, and they needed a doctor there doing family planning. And from there, I went to work for the city and county of San Francisco, doing prenatal and family planning clinics in our Chinatown clinic, and learning some Chinese, Cantonese while I was at it. I learned about 200 words that you couldn't use in a cocktail party, but it worked fine in prenatal clinic. I also got asked by one of the diving schools there if I wanted to be on tap for treating any bends, and I said no, I'd had enough of that while I was in the service. A couple of things we've done in the service, we treated a case of osteomyelitis, infection of the bone, in a hyperbaric chamber. And we also treated a lady that had Clostridia after delivery in one of the chambers there. And we never got a lot of publicity for that. I thought the Navy should get more credit. And we treated a lot of divers when we were out in Pearl Harbor, both black coral divers who were diving over 200 feet and didn't come in until they were paralyzed, and a lot of tourists who would come in and rent a scuba gear, dash off, not knowing what they were doing, and get the bends. And we were able to get them better rules there. So by the time we left, they were requiring that they take some training before they did that. And then after that, after 20 years of practicing OB/GYN, then I retired and I started doing maintenance work, volunteer maintenance work at the church and traveling around the world, and wrote a series of a book every year while I was traveling. Okay. Not a very wide, I've self-published, so I don't think I've sold more than 150, 200 books, but it made a nice diary. That essentially is my life.
Huh. Okay, so you said you were on the dive team that originally went down to the Thresher wreck?
Yeah.
So what exactly did that involve? How exactly did that all go?
Well, first they had to locate where the Thresher went down. It was at 8,500 feet of water. Then they had a very sophisticated sonar system that they were using. Then they got some contacts. So then we had the Trieste, which we brought out there, and that was the bell. There were two Trieste spheres. One was supposed to be good to 5,000 feet and one to 40,000. The 40,000 one is the one they went down in the Mariana Trench, years before. The 5,000 one, we plugged some hole penetrations and changed the warranty to 10,000 feet. So, and it was, we went down in it, then you had probably know what the Trieste composed of, You had 35,000 gallons of aviation gasoline, and you had a deck with some 12-volt batteries, and you had some fancy silver batteries, and you had a little sphere in this. And the idea was, in case you got trapped somewhere, the sphere would release and go to the surface. Well, and they made the first 8 dives. They hadn't really picked up anything. On the 8th dive, they thought they picked up something, and that's when they wanted me to identify some stuff. And we also had a claw. We were able to pick up a piece of pipe that identified the ship, definitely.
Okay.
It would take us about 3 or 4 hours to get to the bottom, because when we were going down, we were just going very slowly. When we got within 100 feet of the bottom, then we had a Japanese fish finder that was very exact, so we wouldn't hit the bottom too hard. Because one time we got stuck in the mud for a little while, another time we hit a rock. You wonder about metal embrittlement and that depth and pressure. But, and essentially, there was a civilian who made every dive, and he got paid the same as any other GS-10 or what he was. He didn't get any diving pay or anything. And then there was Don Keach and Don Welsh and myself. We made the dives with him.
Okay, so you went down. You identified the parts from the thresher.
Yeah.
And 8,500 feet of water.
Yeah. When you were in there, you had the cone-shaped viewing device, and as you got down to the bottom, you noticed it intruded just a little bit into the sphere.
Oh boy.
And I asked Dr. McKenzie, how do you know the thing's going to break? And he said, just before it shatters, it'll turn opaque.
Oh.
I said, good. That's good to know.
That's great to know. So you were you said you served on a lot of different submarines. When you were in the subgroups, you would rotate through different submarines.
Yeah,
then?
we'd go out on them, and ride them and do inspections and see what, and just general check the health and welfare of the people. I wrote my qualification submarines on potable water submarines, because we found a lot of them were storing their water hoses in the bilges and things like that, and some of the sanitary tanks are next to the potable water tanks, and some of the vents are right next to each other. There were a lot of things that we made some suggestions they might change.
Okay. And then when you said they sent you to nuclear power school, do you have a nuclear degree then, or? No,
actually, in nuclear power school, we went for the first part. Then we were doing mostly radiochemistry. Okay. We were, and studying treatment of radiation diseases and accidents.
Okay.
So I didn't have the same training that the nuclear engineer would have.
Okay.
And the prototype, I was supposed to learn all the devices of the nuclear reactor and not do any medical work. Well, I said that was nonsense, so I still conducted sick call every time Admiral Ricko came aboard. They said, "Is he ever in the sick bay?" And they said, "No, he's never here." And I think in a way I was overtrained. I think 26 years of formal education is a little maybe too much, but
okay. So what did you have an undergraduate degree before you went in the Navy then, or?
Well, I had a bachelor's in science. When I went to school, Juniata College. I went in 46, and in spring of 49, I applied to medical school, I thought for the fall of 50. And I got accepted for the fall of 49. I'd taken enough extra courses by going that summer, I could still get my degree.
Okay. So
that saved my father a lot of money.
So you had a medical degree before you entered the Navy?
Yeah, then I got my medical degree 4 years at Temple after that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see here. What else is there? Do you have any kind of interesting stories from any of your shakedown cruises or anything?
Well, as I say, getting hit by
a destroyer.
Having the president come aboard, and before we loaded the missile tubes with water or missiles, we had our dirty laundry in them. And on sea trials, we had, there are really casualties that occur, things that do go wrong. One time, one of the submarines was about to go out, and they found that one of the hull penetrations just had a duct tape over it instead of metal. So fortunately, they didn't go out, because there are all kinds of things. Sea trials are the most interesting things. Otherwise, on Polaris Patrol, you're out there you're sitting there for days on time, waiting for something to happen. But at the first patrol, usually things that are going to go wrong do go wrong. So we had, sometimes our atmosphere control equipment wouldn't work too well, and we'd have to use something else. Or there'd be a little explosion or fire here or there, and the usual things that occur. Since I've retired out here, I go out with a group of submarine veterans. We go out once a month and have lunch together and talk about our various submarine experiences.
What did you do to pass the time on the patrols?
Well, I was doing radiochemistry. I was doing atmosphere monitoring. I was doing radiation monitoring. And I thought I'd have more free time than I did. I didn't.
So you were a busy man. Were you the chief medical officer on the subs that you were on, or?
What?
Were you the chief medical officer on the subs?
Yeah, well, we just had one medical officer in the submarine. We had the corpsman. And then, of course, later on we took all the doctors off. The reason we had the doctors on the first nuclear boats is we weren't sure what would happen to people when they're out there for a while.
Okay.
What the effects would be of breathing really essentially the same molecules for 2-3 months at a time. And once we discovered that nothing terrible happened, then we took the doctors off.
Okay.
Yes.
How long? What's the longest time you spent underwater then?
63 days.
63 during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah.
Okay. And you were just deployed up under the polar ice for all that, or?
We were up under the ice further, and you duck out occasionally.
Okay. Okay. Let's see. You said that are any of the guys in your submarine group that you go out with, or did you serve with any of them, or are they just guys that were also on submarines?
Did I what?
Did you serve with any of them individually, or?
Well, on the submarines, you got to know people pretty well that you're with. Yeah, when I was at nuclear prototype, a lot of those people came to the submarine because.
Okay.
Yeah, for the first, what they call the plank owners, which is what they call you when you're on a commissioning crew.
Okay.
That crew was pretty well trained together, so you get to know those people probably better than you would anyone else.
Okay.
One of the first submarines I used to ride, and the one I went down to the Caribbean on when I was in sub school, is called the Torsk. It's still in the harbor in Baltimore. It's a museum piece there.
Okay. Yeah. What would you after you left the service, what do you think the service did for you once you get out? Like, did you get any have special skills besides being able to live in a cramped spot?
Little special skills in treating bends and air embolism and in radiation sickness if needs be. I got a feeling of belonging to something, like being on a part of a crew for a while, which is not something you get too often.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Okay.
And a lot of excitement too,
You definitely enjoyed it then, I can tell.
I did.
It was.
If I'd gone to one of the senior schools, I probably would have stayed in longer. But I think my wife was just happy I didn't.
Okay.
She had to keep getting licenses everywhere I went, and getting new jobs and so forth.
Okay.
So I think she was thankful when I retired.
Did you have to change? Did your licensing change when you had to move, or?
No, I had a California license when I came aboard, but I never did any outside practice until I went back to California.
Okay.
And kept that license. So.
Okay. Let's see here. What else is there? What was it like after you came out? Was it difficult transition to civilian life?
Well, it was somewhat different. I mean, in the service, most of the people were fairly healthy, and you were sort of isolated from the world. There were a lot of things going on in the 60s and 70s that I really never paid much attention to.
Okay.
Yeah. We were in our own little world,
Right. Okay. So, like, I can't imagine how, like, sitting on a submarine underwater for 60 days. It just seems like the longest time. Like.
They went fast.
Really. And then how would it work? Would you rotate? You said you would have shore leave and then you go back on patrol.
You had a blue and a gold crew.
Okay.
So that during the off period time, you were getting things ready and you were having some free time and you could work at the hospital. I was always able to work at a station hospital when I was someplace.
Okay. So then you split. You were saying that you were towards the end of your military service, you were assigned to a hospital?
Well, at the end, No, I went to it was the Mare Island Shipyard. We had a
Okay.
dispensary there,
Okay.
which had used to be a big hospital, but now it's just a dispensary. So,
Okay.
and I could still do my gynecology practice there, in
Okay.
addition to being in charge of the dispensary. And
That's a whole different field. You go from OBGYN, then you go onto a nuclear submarine, and you're trained in chemical or radiation chemistry.
Yeah. It's interesting. Yeah. My father was a chemist.
Okay.
Yeah, he taught chemistry for 38 years.
Okay. Is that why did you aspire to become a doctor in the first place? Was it partly that, or?
Well, let's see. I had some relatives who were doctors, and it's saying I wanted to take care of people, and I decided I was not too mechanically minded, though a little better than I thought. And I said, well, I'll just go along. If I get accepted, I'll go in. And I just sort of drifted along.
Why what was the driving force behind wanting to join the Navy for it?
Well, I knew some people, friends of my father had been in the Navy, and I knew in the Navy at least I have a bunk,
Right.
you know, and they did interesting things.
Okay.
So that
It was just an exciting little ride you got to have. Let's see. I think that's almost it. When you got off the submarines, then was about when they stopped putting doctors on subs?
after I was sub-pack medical officer, just a few years later we stopped. Yeah, once we knew, the corpsmen could be well trained, we trained some of the engineers to do the radiochemistry.
Okay.
You know.
What is the radiochemistry involved on the sub?
Well, you're testing the primary coolant that
Okay.
goes through. Because I remember one time before we went out on a sea trial, I was testing it, and suddenly I started getting fairly high levels of various manganese and iron, and said something's wrong here. So I went to see the commanding officer, and then we talked with the engineering officer. The engineering officer said, well, it'll clear up when we go out to sea. And I said, I don't think so. So finally we had the people from Bechtel come down. We'd had what they call an air accident, where somehow a little air had gotten into the primary coolant to one of the pipes. And if we had gone out to sea and raised our power anymore, we would have had to have been towed back in again. It'd been very embarrassing.
Oh, okay. So you did the radiochemistry for that, and you monitored the reactor. And then after
And atmosphere control. We had a Mark V atmosphere analyzer, analyzed for oxygen and for CO2 and for freon and CO and hydrocarbons.
Okay. And you said when that would break, you'd have to improvise. What did you mean by
Well,
that?
sometimes when our CO2 scrubbers, which use liquid amine, which when it was cold, you'd absorb the CO2. When it's hot, you'd give it off.
Okay.
Well, some of those broke down, so then we had to go to similar. We had little canisters of CO2 absorbent that we used, and when the explosion in the oxygen generator, we had other devices of iron oxide that would produce oxygen. I mean, these are all things that could be repaired.
You had an explosion in the oxygen generator?
Well, yeah. In fact, that was even before we went out, and the fellow from Treadwell came down and said, usually they blow up over here. Because, you're taking 3,000 amps of electricity, you're taking water, with very pure water, and you're running a lot of current through it, and you have a thin membrane, on one side oxygen comes out, the other side hydrogen comes out. And we pump the hydrogen overboard. But if you get a little rupture in there, then the two mix, and hydrogen at certain percentages is rather explosive.
And it just happened to explode?
Yeah, it just tore out a little piece of it, and they fixed it. But I was amused that the Treadwell man said, usually they blow up over here.
Oh, okay. So it just seems like that's just another day at the office. The oxygen or the CO2 scrubbers break, or the oxygen generator just explodes.
And we had what they call a COH2 burner, where if you had freon in the atmosphere, or you had, a lot of the smoke, we allowed smoking on board in those days. And a lot of the atmosphere control equipment took care of the smoke.
Yeah.
I probably have more smoke in my lungs, even though I never smoked in my life, though, than most people. Yeah.
It's like a box of smoke down there. That's quite interesting.
We had charcoal filters, we had electrostatic precipitators, a lot of atmosphere control equipment. If you had it totally run by robots, you wouldn't need all that stuff.
Yeah. Okay. So while you were down in the subs, did you see, as a doctor, did you have to deal with any like serious casualties? Or
We had a hangnail, but the corpsman won the toss for that. And we had, when we were ashore, I went up to where I got a call, and I went to where the fellow was living. He'd had an alcohol problem. He thought we cleared up, and then he went off the wagon, and he was obviously dead when I got there.
Oh wow. Okay.
But I mean, and we didn't have any major serious accidents or anything.
That's good then.
Things are, and I told them if they had to require any surgery, they'd get a phalangeal scar, an obstetrical scar. Also, as a joke, I told the supply officer, I said, I want some maggots and leeches for the first patrol. It was a joke, but I had very little sick call.
Okay.
Well, maggots and leeches work well,
Yeah. So you just spent most of your time there was just spent monitoring
that, and
all those things.
And it was, as I say, it went by reasonably fast. I thought we'd get a little bridge playing in, but we never did. We didn't have time for that.
Oh, okay. Okay. What was the Thomas Edison one of the first nuclear subs then, or?
No, it was in the second class
Okay.
of a Polaris submarine.
Okay.
They took the George Washington was the first class. They took a regular nuclear submarine and then tore out a section of the middle and put in the 16 missiles.
Okay.
And then the Jefferson, I guess it was the next group of Polaris submarines, and then they came back. They keep coming along with better and better ones, you hope.
Yeah. Okay.
And now, of course, we have the Triton.
Yeah. It's just they've gotten it's just huge, those subs. They can just do so much.
Yeah.
It's got to be a world of difference from now to then. But,
Oh, yeah. Well, that's what's so interesting. Starting out on diesel boats and then ending up on
on a nuclear
Nuclear
submarine,
ones, yeah.
underwater for months
Yeah.
at a time. Anything else you want to add, or?
No, just as I say, I never really got shot at. When I went with the Marines, they had us in field medicine school crawl under barbed wire with live machine guns over the top, but that was just part of our orientation.
Okay.
So I never really been. Of course, if the Russians could have found us when we were in patrol, I don't think they'd been too happy. But
Right. And what was the Cuban Missile Crisis like on the boat? Was it tense, or were you guys worried that something would happen? Or
no, I mean you took it in stride. You
just do it as a job.
Yeah.
Okay.
They sent messages out every week, and they had what they called familygrams, and the wives could send information to us. We couldn't send anything back. But
Right.
and it was good because there'd be a blurb of information, and buried in this, could be the message fire, or something.
Oh. Okay. That's about it then. I can't think of anything else.
Okay,
But,
well,
if you don't have anything else, then
no,
I guess.
as I said, my
we
wife
might do
said
that.
I probably talked too much.
No, definitely not. Definitely not. I guess I said that. Thank you.
But
Thank
there
you
are
for
other
the-
people here, like, fellow I play bridge with who was in the Battle of the Bulge, World War
Okay.
II. He's seen a lot more,
I'll have to get his name from you.
Yeah.
But